I like to think of myself as a fairly wide reader, and with that in mind I started thinking about whether I could recommend a book from every genre. So that's what we're going to attempt today. So I consulted Google to look up a list of genres and cross-referenced that with Goodreads and added in a couple that I thought I was missing. So I hope I've got a pretty comprehensive list of genres for you today. I read from some of these genres more than others, so some of these recommendations might be a little bit tenuous, but it's just for fun. I've also tried to make some of these recommendations an introduction to these genres, so if you don't usually read them, you might like to try this as a way of seeing if it's for you. And for most of the genres, I've got just one recommendation. Some of them I've allowed myself to, and I'll explain why once we get there. Okay, let's go. First up, we have historical fiction, and for this category I'm going to recommend Rizzio by Denise, Mina. This is a very short little novella, but it packs a punch. It's about Mary Queen of Scots and the murder of her best friend David Rizzio. It's very funny, deliciously dark, and a perfectly formed little book. Science fiction. I can't recommend anything other than The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. This is about a wonderful group of alien and human characters who are in a ragtag bunch on a spaceship with a mission to go and form a kind of space tunnel from a remote planet to the kind of metropolis, if you like. What Becky Chambers does brilliantly is she uses science fiction and alien concepts to really drill down on what it means to be human and what we mean by humanity. It's beautiful and really good fun, so I really recommend The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet for any reader, let alone whether you're into science fiction or not. Next up we have fantasy, and I have two recommendations, and the reason for this is that one is a bit darker and one is a bit lighter. So let's go with the darker first. Set over the course of one night, a winter solstice, Saturnalia is about Mina. She used to work at the infamous Saturn Club as a sort of tarot reader, but she hasn't worked there for a while and has fallen out with the people who were close to her at that time. But on this night, she's sent on a mission to go back to the Saturn Club to obtain something very mysterious. It's dark, it's weird, but it's really, really brilliantly written and a real page turner. It's set in a future world that we can really easily imagine, but with some kind of gothic fantasy twists. So a really easy dip into fantasy if you've never tried it before. If you're curious about fantasy but would like to try something a bit lighter, I'd recommend The House on the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. This is a really heartwarming story. It's set in a world where magical beings exist, but they are segregated and really carefully monitored by a government agency. One of these agents is sent to a school where these children live and is reporting back to his superiors about whether the children are safe to be in this world. But the more time he spends there, the more he gets to know the children and their carer, the less loyalty he feels towards his job. It's beautiful, it's really heartwarming. TJ Klune is another author that really successfully uses the fantastical to define what it means to be human. Our next genre is mystery, and I would like to recommend Elizabeth is Missing by Emma Healey. Maud is very confused all of the time. She has dementia and relies on notes around her house to remind her of even the simplest things. The problem is Maud is really convinced that something nefarious has gone on. Her friend Elizabeth is missing, but nobody seems to believe her. As she tries to piece together the clues that she's left for herself to try and understand what's happened to Elizabeth, she unlocks some memories from her childhood, which leads to an even greater mystery. It's a really brilliant read and a really good gateway into a mystery story if that's not your usual genre. Next up is horror, and I don't have a copy of this. I presume I've lent it to somebody, but I would like to recommend Grady Hendrix. My personal favourite is the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying a Vampire. Grady Hendrix writes horror like nobody else. I wouldn't read horror in any other circumstances unless it's his writing. He has a really fun, nostalgic way of writing, and you forget that you're reading something so dark and twisted because he makes it so much fun. So that's the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. If you're looking for a thriller, I would recommend Magpie by Elizabeth Day. It's not your usual thriller. It's more of a psychological thriller than a sort of murder mystery type situation. It's about a couple who get a lodger, but not all is as it seems. And I will say no more than that. It was really twisty and I didn't see stuff coming, and I had a really good time reading this. So I would recommend, so that's Magpie by Elizabeth Day. My recommendation for literary fiction is Elmet by Fiona Mozley. This is a book that has lived rent-free in my head since I turned the last page. It was stunning. It's about a single parent family living off-grid, a father, a daughter and a son, whilst they're just trying to live out their lives in peace following some alluded to difficulties in their past. Local landowners don't want them to stay, and things escalate beyond comprehension for this family. It's violent, it's gripping, it's still and thoughtful and reflective. It was an absolutely brilliant read, and these characters, this family, won't ever leave me. This is where I stretch my genres somewhat. So for romance, I'm going to recommend The Mermaid of Black Conch. I'm not much of a romance reader, I'll hold my hands up and admit that. But this book is definitely romantic, it's definitely about love, and it's beautifully written. Our main character is a mermaid, and she has been captured by visiting fishermen on this Caribbean island. And a local fisherman, David, rescues her and takes her home and pops her in his bath. And as they figure out each other and get to know each other, he treats her with such tenderness and care, and they form this relationship. But ultimately she is a mermaid. It can't last. So be prepared for a little bit of heartbreak. My recommendation for YA fiction is Monday's Not Coming by Tiffany D. Jackson. I listened to this on audio. Claudia turns up for her first day back at school after the summer break, but her best friend Monday isn't there. And when Monday doesn't come in the next day, or the next day, she's incredibly suspicious, but nobody seems to have much of an answer for her. She tries to do some investigating of her own and visits Monday's mum and sister, but nobody will give her a straight answer, and nobody seems to remember really clearly the last time that they actually saw Monday. And things take a pretty dark turn. This is a story about the endurance of friendship, of identity, and it asks questions like who speaks up for those without a voice. My pick for adventure is Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. Marion Graves grows up as a wild child in Prohibition America, and all the way through this book her character is entirely focused on seeking out freedom. This leads her to a lifelong obsession with flying, and she becomes a pilot. This book leads up to her greatest adventure, to circumnavigate the globe pole to pole in a plane. Over half a century later, a film is being made about Marion's life. Although Marion's Great Circle happens at the end of this book, her whole life is a super adventure. I'd really recommend Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. I Who Have Never Known Men by Jaqueline Harpman, translated from the French by Schwartz, is my pick for dystopian fiction. The less you know about this going into it, the better, I think. But our young narrator is one of 39 women who are imprisoned underground in a cage. They don't remember clearly the events that led up to their capture, they don't know why they're there, and they don't know how long they've been there for. This was incredible. We read it for a book club and it raised so many really interesting questions. For speculative fiction, I'm going to recommend Runt by Niall Griffiths. This is about a 16-year-old boy who has to go and live with his uncle, who he calls his drunkle, on a farm because his mum's abusive near partner doesn't want him living with them anymore. So he goes up and lives on his uncle's farm, his drunkle's farm, on the Welsh Hills with his dog. This was a really interesting read that took me a little while to get into, if I'll be totally honest. Our main character's mind is a little bit like being in the mind of the BFG. The way that he speaks and the way that he sees the world is totally unique. But once you get into that and get into the rhythm of this writing and his thoughts, this is a really fascinating read. It crosses myth and folklore and is disturbing and moving, all told through the inner monologue of our main character. My pick for children's literature is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. Sophie's older sisters have been sent off to be married, but she has to work as a milliner. And one day, the Witch of the Waste turns her into an old lady with a curse. In an attempt to break the curse, she goes in search of the elusive and mysterious magician Howl and his moving castle. When she finds them, she infiltrates the castle and gets to know the residents. But Howl isn't all that he seems. Can Sophie break the curse, and can Howl overthrow the Witch of the Waste? This is a really beautiful story that's been turned into a Studio Ghibli movie. So that's my recommendation for children's literature. Here's my recommendation for crime. This is The Dinner Lady Detectives by Hannah Hendy. Hannah is a local author and our characters live in a fictionalised town based on where I live. Marjorie and Clementine are partners who live together and work together as dinner ladies in their local school. Their peaceful lives are shattered one day when they arrive at work to find their kitchen manager dead in the fridge. The police are convinced that it's a case of accidental death, but our dinner ladies think otherwise and endeavour to investigate this potential crime. This is the first in a series. There are a few more. It's a really cosy mystery and really good fun. Next up is memoir and autobiography, and I actually have two recommendations because I couldn't decide between them. The first is I May Be Wrong by Bjorn Nathiko Lindeblad. Bjorn gave up the corporate life and moved to Thailand to become a Buddhist monk. And these pages contain his reflections about what he learnt from that time as a monk and his life afterwards. What I loved about this was that Bjorn was a pretty rubbish monk. He found meditation really difficult, and that fallible approach to his faith made this a really endearing read. What also makes this an extraordinary read is that Bjorn then left his life as a Buddhist monk and readjusted to life outside of Buddhism. He married and had a family and sadly contracted a rare life-limiting disease and made the decision to opt for an assisted death. So Bjorn had actually died when this book was published. Bjorn was warm and funny and a fantastic human being, really curious about himself and others, and there's so much to be learned in these pages. The other book that I would like to recommend under memoir and autobiography is Unprotected by Billy Porter. I listened to this on audiobook. I first came across Billy Porter in Pose, but he has been a star his entire life. It's been an incredibly difficult life, and every success he has had to fight for. It's an incredible memoir. I laughed, I cried, I felt every human emotion you can possibly imagine. His life is extraordinary and his story deserves to be told and heard. Next up is short story, and I've got an interesting recommendation here because this short story is the best short story I've ever read. However, the collection that it belongs to, the rest of the stories were naff. So the short story that I loved is Vampires in the Lemon Grove by Karen Russell. It's about a couple of vampires who are living the high life in Italy, eating lemons instead of sucking blood. And after many years of being together, one pines for a more traditional vampiric life and the other doesn't. And it's the story of their relationship changing and evolving. It's heartbreaking and beautiful and vividly poetic. It was an amazing story and I will never forget it, but as I say, the rest of the stories in this collection didn't do it for me, but this particular one was worth buying the whole book for. Okay, we're back to tenuous recommendations. My recommendation for westerns is How Much of These Hills is Gold by C. Pam Zhang. Set in the American West in the gold rush era, two siblings set off on a journey carrying the corpse of their dead father. This story shows us both how they came to that point and what happened afterwards. Everyone that you think of as the good guys at the start of this book completely flip their narrative by the end. And as these two sisters journey to find their own futures, they understand just how much they are defined by their past. The next genre is women's fiction, which I think is a bit of an odd genre, but we're here. So I'm going to recommend The Bread the Devil Need by Lisa Allen Agostini. Alethea is the most incredible character. So set in Trinidad, she is fierce, independent, intelligent. She works in a shop in her 40s and she's having an affair with a local shop manager. Alongside all of this, she is covering up bruises from her abusive partner. It captures beautifully the fact that anybody can experience domestic violence, and as she reflects on her current situation, she has to work out who she wants to be and how she will allow herself to be defined. Not only is In by Will MacPhail my favourite graphic novel, but it is one of my favourite reading experiences of all time. I will never forget the afternoon that I spent in the garden reading this book. It's stunning. The artwork is very beautiful, his use of colour is stunning, and he's so funny. So this is about a character who's not really got his life very together. He's a bit chaotic and he comes to learn that his mum has cancer. It's about a relationship that he starts, it's about his relationship with his mum, and it's about his own relationship with himself. It's very beautiful, it's very funny. I both laughed out loud and shed really big tears at this. It was wonderful. That's In by Will MacPhail. The Bandit Queens by Perini Schroff is my recommendation for humour. Gita lives alone since her husband disappeared and the rest of her village think that she killed him, so they give her a pretty wide berth until one of the women think that she can help get rid of her abusive husband. Gita neither wants to admit that she didn't do anything to her husband or help somebody else kill theirs, and so ensues chaos. This is about the power of female connection in all its forms in the face of oppression. It explores some really complex dark themes with a really light touch and is just brilliantly done and very funny. Our next category, as identified by Google, is paranormal romance. Yeah, I've got nothing. For translated fiction, I would like to recommend Swallowing Mercury by Violetta Gregg, translated from the Polish by Eliza Marciniak. This is a really beautiful coming of age story. It explores the mundane through the extraordinary. It's about Viola, who grows up in a rural Polish community surrounded by folklore and fable and superstition and family ritual. The extraordinary thing about this book is how layered it is with texture and colour and sensory descriptions. It left a really lasting impression. For my classics recommendation, I have for you A Welsh Witch by Alan Wren. Alan Wren is a pen name for Anne Adeliza Puddicombe. She wrote this book in 1902. It's about a small Welsh fishing village where Catrin is the village scapegoat, accused of being a witch for her difference, until she's befriended by the very popular Goronwy. As they grow up together, their lives become more and more complicated as other people's expectations are placed upon them. Goronwy is expected to marry another in the village, and Catrin moves away with her gypsy family. But eventually they are reunited. But will everybody get their happy ending? The poetry book that I would like to recommend to you is Goliath by Rhiannon Hewson. This is a delightful little collection full of poems that centre nature and the climate crisis through the lens of womanhood and that which is beyond human. Next up is non-fiction, and I have two recommendations for you for non-fiction. For something on the serious side, Everyone's Invited by Soma Sara is a collection of essays which explore rape culture. It picks apart the systemic issues that contribute to violence against women and girls and calls for urgent change. And my second recommendation for non-fiction, something a little bit lighter, is Love That Journey For Me by Emily Garside. This is kind of niche. It's one of the 404 Inklings. So these are sort of very bite-sized pocket-sized books that explore a very niche kind of topic. And in this instance, it's the queer revolution of Schitt's Creek. I'm a huge fan of the TV show Schitt's Creek, and Emily Garside explores how it was revolutionary for the queer community. Last but not least, our last genre is self-help, and for that my recommendation is The Happy Empath by Christine Rose L. This book changed my life as somebody who identifies as an empath. A book to guide me into how I can honour this gift but also protect my energy was revolutionary and life-changing. So I really recommend The Happy Empath. We did it! We recommended a book for every genre. How amazing is that? Thank you so much for watching. If you think I've missed any genres, then please pop them in the comments, and if you have any of your own recommendations, I'd really love to hear them. And if you are a booktuber, I'd love to see you do this too. We're not getting into tags, I'm not that person. But yeah, I'd love to see somebody else give this a go too. Thank you so much for watching. I'm really grateful for you. Take good care.